Thank you so much for being here. Alyssa Wong has been caught in an unexpected time warp. She will be joining us as soon as she's able to. But we will go ahead and get started and look forward to her showing up when she can show up. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's an enormous pleasure to me to be able to talk to these women. I already, full disclosure, I know Kat, I know Alyssa, Ashley and I are meeting here for the first time, but I cannot think of three women I would be more interested in talking to. So this is a treat from my point of view. I'd like to start off by thanking the Clarion community, the many supporters that we have, including and especially some of the people who help us provide scholarships, the Carl Brandon Society, George R.R. Martin, and many other people. Also for general support, Sue and Steve Hart have been amazing year after year. Penguin Random House has been very generous with us, and Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore has been with us for the whole time we've been in San Diego. So we truly could not do it without all of you people, and I'm pleased to have a chance to say so. Thank you very much. We are also at this moment in the early stages of an annual fundraiser called the Write-a-thon. Patrick, are you going to be able to put up a link?
Yes,
Great.
I will.
Great. We've got a number of writers working already in the Write-a-thon, and also very grateful to them, but anybody else who can join in or stop by and throw some money at some of our writers, that would be beyond wonderful. We would love it. The Write-a-thon money all goes to scholarship support. I'm going to just do a very brief history of the early years of Clarion. And Stan Robinson next week is going to pick up where I leave off. So the Clarion Workshop began in 1968, and the person who founded it was Robin Scott Wilson, a writer and teacher. He was at Clarion State at the time. The workshop took place at Clarion State, hence the name, although it did not stay at Clarion State very long. Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight were involved almost immediately and soon took it over from Robin Scott Wilson. In that very first year in 1968, we had Ed Bryant and Vonda McIntyre as students, both of whom went on to wonderful and consequential careers, both of whom we have lost fairly recently. So we miss their work, we miss their friendship, and we miss that link to our early history. Also, we have lost Kate and Damon, who were the heart and soul of Clarion for decades. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Kate was the heart and Damon was the soul, but I'm willing to be schooled on that. They, for decades after the workshop moved to East Lansing at the University of Michigan, they always taught the final 2 weeks as a team. And so they worked with untold numbers of writers, and untold numbers of writers went through that workshop experience in East Lansing, where it was very hot in the summers, and you had to live on cafeteria food, as you still do, but otherwise things were quite magical. Coming from the West Coast, whenever I taught there, I always hoped there would be a big thunderstorm, because I had those as a child and I miss them desperately. And usually East Lansing provided. The method that the Clarion Workshop uses is often the one that Kate and Damon created out of a peer workshop they called the Milford, and so we call it the Milford method. It involves sitting in a circle and responding to somebody's work one at a time while the writer sits in agonized silence waiting for their chance to say something. This is not the only method that we use. We have instructors who prefer the workshop to function in other ways, and we very much believe in giving our faculty free rein to teach in the way that they think is best. But it is still probably the most common workshop method, the most common Clarion method. One can only assume, based on lethal amounts of charm, Kate and Damon managed to talk the University of Michigan into supporting us for many years. But eventually, as university budgets tightened, that money ran out. And then there were some years of tumult and chaos, including an attempted hostile takeover, much excitement. And finally, we landed at UC San Diego, which is where I will let Stan pick up the story. So, to turn to the main event, I'm wondering if I should introduce Alyssa in her absence or if I should wait until she arrives. I will be thinking about it while I introduce Kat. Since her first publication in 2004, Kat Valente has won, and you will know that I have not won some of these awards because I will have so much trouble pronouncing them. The Andre Norton, the Tiptree, the Sturgeon, the Prix Imaginales, the Eugie Foster Memorial, the Mythopoeic, the Rhysling, the Lambda, the Locus, the Romantic Times Critics' Choice, and the Hugo Awards. So much winning, Kat.
So much losing too, though. I've lost way more awards than that.
Oh, hey, hooray, hooray. Hello, Alyssa.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I got super stuck in LA traffic, which I was not expecting, but oops.
Well, here you are. And we're actually just beginning because I've been nattering on, so you're perfect. I'm just in the middle of Kat's introduction. Kat is suspiciously prolific, but we expect her young son will soon put a stop to that. Her prose is notable for its gorgeousness. It's imagistic, playful, and musical. She was a much-loved instructor at Clarion, and we hope to have her back when we close the book on the particular science fiction novel we're currently living through and start a new one where workshops are real things again. Alyssa Wong was one of my students at Clarion, where she arrived already writing powerful and unsettling stories. She then studied fiction at NC State. She's won the Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards and is writing the new run of Dr. Afra comics about, in words, the galaxy's favorite amoral rogue archaeologist. Her short stories are particularly notable for their dangerous, often scary sexiness. The genre that has her in its claws is horror, and I've heard an exciting rumor that she's maybe working on a novel, which I will expect her to confirm or deny this evening. Ashley Bloom's debut novel, Every Bone a Prayer, will be released on August 4th from Source Books. Make a note in your calendars. She's a graduate of the Clarion Workshop and has an MFA from the University of Mississippi. She's published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Strange Horizons and Shimmer. Her stories are particularly notable for their Appalachian settings and for their intense, complex, and unflinching engagement with issues of trauma. An early review has praised her for her raw-bone language. Another has called her honest and elusive. She is currently working on a second novel. I want to start off by acknowledging the current moment of protest and pandemic, the days of doom and Zoom, and ask the three of you if you ever respond to current events in your work, given that writers often need things to marinate for a while. Do you anticipate that the events of this current time will find their way into your work in some twisted form or another at some point? Kat, would you mind beginning?
I found it hard to, normally I do take some time to process and literally process like sausage experience into art. But this time it's so all pervasive that I've had a really hard time keeping it out. I was asked to write a story almost as soon as the lockdown started at the end of March about the pandemic. So that easily is the fastest I've ever turned something that was happening, it hadn't even really happened yet, into a story. And I have a story coming out in Strange Horizons that I wrote just as the protests were starting. And I eventually just had to give up and let the protests into the story because I wasn't really able to keep it out. I think that what is going on now is it just affects every aspect of our lives from the top. It's like this is happening everywhere to everyone at the same time. It's very difficult to work without, for me, to work without involving it. And I'm finishing a middle grade book right now, but the other thing I'm working on, the next big project I'm working on, is the sequel to Space Opera, which is a book inspired by Eurovision. And for those of you who know what Eurovision is, you may know it was canceled this year. And I genuinely feel that, like, if I had written this book on time, it wouldn't be the book it's going to be now that I know Eurovision can be canceled. In 65 years, it's never been canceled. Like, all of these things are happening right now, and it's impossible to just turn your face away from it, because the minute you turn your face, you're just looking at another aspect of it.
Thank you. Alyssa, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I think is the first answer. Yes. I think as Kat said, it's everything is happening right now, and it affects everything that, the way we think about things, the way we experience them. And I think naturally that affects what we write about. At the same time, there's so much happening, and all of it is very important and very intense, and that in a lot of ways for me, it's kind of hard to write right now.
Yes. Also
so
hard to read in some ways, I'm finding.
It is. So I think it's right now personally I'm wrestling with so what are the responsible ways to respond and to take action, and like, is the work that I'm doing as a writer like frivolous in this time? And I think the answer is no, but at the same time I also expect everything that is happening right now in this moment of time to affect me for the rest of my life, so it's gonna keep marinating and processing, and it's gonna keep pushing up through the stuff I write.
So Ashley, you presumably finished a book before a lot of this hit, and now you're writing a second book. Are you finding change as a result?
It's definitely been a different writing process than I'm used to this time around. Not just with like second book syndrome and like the strangeness already of trying to follow up your debut, but also with everything going on. I found that I can't really expect the kind of consistency that I normally expect from myself. I'm sort of a workhorse writer, I'm like, I show up, I put in the work. That's just kind of the way I've always operated. But that's not really been a fair standard to continue setting for myself during this time. So I've had to be a lot more flexible with just my routine. And then with everything going on, I think, like Alyssa and Catherine have said, like, the thinking about how my work is engaging with power structures, which is something it often does, but it's like, how, in light of everything that's happening, how is that going to change? What am I saying here? My second book deals with some drug abuse, and there are cops and like relationships between the characters and local law enforcement. And I was already treading carefully, but now I'm really thinking of it, I think, even more closely, and not wanting to contribute anything harmful. And so it can be a little overwhelming, I think, sometimes to be writing and working in the midst of this and being worried about what your voice is going to be adding to the ecosystem and whether or not that's going to be harmful or helpful.
Yeah, I think all of that strikes me as very true, but also, you can't guess how every reader is going to respond. So in your attempts to do no harm, you're operating in a sort of blind house of mirrors where someone may see something that you did not intend, that you may or may not be responsible for, but could not have anticipated. So yeah, it's tricky stuff, I think. I'm doing a historical novel at the moment, so.
Smart, I think that's smart.
Kat, you said that you never want to write about anything that could actually happen. How do you account for this prejudice against plausibility?
It is a prejudice against plausibility. I'm just not interested in that, really. The thing is that I live in the real world full of things that can actually happen, and it just never really has the resonance that a book can have. I would like there to be reasons for things, and there aren't in the real world. I would like things to be brighter and more glittery, even if it's horrible glitter. But at the same time, I think part of what really draws me to science fiction and fantasy is that you can do this trick with science fiction and fantasy that you can't do with realism, which is that you can distract someone over here with all the glitter and the robots and the dragons and whatever you like, and then you can hit them in the back of the head with a truth that they would have all of their defenses up if it were a story that could really happen, and wouldn't be able to receive the same way. You can say things with science fiction and fantasy. You can connect with people on a level that for me, realism just doesn't do. And it's totally fine if realism does that for other people. That's fine. Yay, awesome. That's why realist writers get paid lots of money. That's fine. But for me, where I get really excited is the confluence of real life and the fantastic. The places where they flow together, the places where they comment on each other, the places where one reveal corners of the other that they wouldn't otherwise be able to explore. That's what really gets me going as an artist. And so I've thought about it from time to time. You know, do I have anything to say about divorce in the suburbs, having been divorced in the suburbs? But I don't really, unless I can make those people divorcing in the suburbs liches or something. Like I just, but because I feel like I can say so much more with a lich than I can with a stay-at-home dad. and I just, it doesn't draw me in the same way. The closest thing to sort of realism that draws me is murder mysteries or crime novels. And I would certainly love to do that. But then when I think about that, my brain's immediately like, can it be science fiction and fantasy too? So it's just, it is science fiction, fantasy, horror. These are my great loves in literature. They always have been since I was a tiny child. And I think that, you know, one of the privileges of being published is that you get to pursue those things that excited you as a small child. And I feel like I should keep with the things that excite me instead of trying to write something that just doesn't get me revved up.
I just want to say that I think the phrase horrible glitter go on a t-shirt immediately. I would wear it. Alyssa and Ashley, could you tell your stories in the realist mode when you work in fantasy and science fiction? Is that a choice or a necessity? Ashley, why don't you start?
My work tends to sort of bridge the two pretty evenly, or at least kind of evenly. A lot of my stories are set in the real world and sort of more fabulous in nature. So they have sort of supernatural or surreal elements that kind of sort of creep up through the cracks of the natural world. But I feel very similarly to the way that you do, Catherynne, in that those elements are so vital to the story. And I think vital for me especially when writing about trauma or power structures and sort of exposing the oddness of those experiences, right? So if something traumatic happens, like literally in our lives, like there's a whole wide array of responses that we have to that are actually very strange, right? So like even symptoms of PTSD, right? You can have flashbacks, which is like a kind of time travel, right? You can be transported through time, through your senses. And there's like a ton of them that are very strange, and they affect the way that you experience the world. And so as someone with PTSD, I found that the strange and the surreal are often tools, and some of the strongest tools that I have for recreating an experience, like an authentic or more truthful or real feeling experience of what it is to sort of go through a traumatic experience and try to kind of re-piece together what has become fragmented, you know, and it never fits back perfectly. It's never exactly the way it was before, but there's something really strange and fantastic and often horrifying about that process. And that's often the way that my fantastical elements was the sort of the role that they will play, is allowing me to get closer to that. But it's often very much rooted in the real world. My debut novel is set in Appalachian. It's a little girl who's growing up there, you know, and they go to church and they go to her aunt's house, and it's these very sort of normal routines, but there are also, you know, statues growing out of her landlord's yard. And the little girl learns how to take off her skin in the book and walk around as bones. And all of these things feel like necessary tools to tell the story that I wanted to tell. So I often find the blending is somehow realer than real for me.
I would think that often the process of reconstruction and the places where it doesn't quite fit must be some of the most interesting places.
Absolutely.
Alyssa, I'm going to swing around. Obviously I've never Zoomed at this time of day, so I keep trying to get out of the sunlight. I'm going to try this way now. Alyssa, what about you?
I was gonna say, I feel that I have like minor heat stroke from being out in the sun all day. Yeah, I mean, so I write about whatever interests me, and I think that I'm lucky in the sense that a lot of things interest me. So for me, it's just a story by story basis. Like if I am really interested in ghosts and I want to write about that, I'll absolutely write a weird ghost story. But like I also love memoir, especially short memoir is really interesting. And I also love literary fiction and poetry. So for me, I guess when I build a story, I just think about what I want that story to be. And if it's realist, then it's realist. Also, my caveat is that I have only written one realist story ever. When
you say what you want the story to be, are you talking about what the impact on the reader you want, or?
Well, sort of.
Can you unpack that phrase a little for me?
Yeah, sure. So when I think about what I want a story to be, I think about like, I usually start with an image or like an idea, and then I sort of build it out in like circles out from there. So like, I wrote the story when I was at Clarion, when you were teaching, called The Fisher Queen, and I had wanted to write a mermaid story. I'd really wanted to write a mermaid story, but I couldn't find the right angle. And I was like, what about mermaids interests me? I don't care about mermaids. And then I was like, but I do care about fish. I love big fish. So I was like, I'm gonna write a big fish story. But I was also thinking about like, basically like trauma that a lot of women experience, especially like in the context of I had just finished college. So I was like, I'm gonna write about that too. Weird legends of mermaids and stuff. So that was a time where I was like, I'm gonna write about this cluster of things that really interest me. But my realist story is actually a retelling of Artemis and Actaeon, the myth. But instead of being about a goddess and a huntsman who sees her while she's bathing, it's about a streamer and Gamergate. So that is very, very different, but still has some like strange elements to it. So yeah, I mean, literally it's just whatever I'm thinking about.
I want to, Kat mentioned the books that she loved to read as a child, and there's sort of a thread that goes through her entire life to date. And as luck would have it, my next question was sort of about the impact of your own childhood on your work. How present it remains when you write. And also whether or not you had a magical childhood, keeping in mind that magic can be terrifying as well as wonderful. Would you say that you had a magical childhood? And Alyssa, why don't you continue?
Oh God, okay. Yeah, I definitely had a magical childhood. I grew up in the desert in a very, very sort of niche, small Chinese Christian community, where I read the Bible all the time when I was a kid. So the idea that, I remember learning that you could just exorcise demons if you just like prayed enough, like it was fine. NBD, got you fam. I think magical thinking was very built into that and my understanding of the world as a kid. So yeah, I had a pretty magical childhood. It just didn't occur to me in a lot of ways that a lot of things couldn't happen or exist in strange, fantastical ways. And I think that's sort of...
I love that.
And I got lucky in that I wasn't told until at least about 4th grade that was a bizarre way of thinking about the world.
Who told you?
Public school. So yeah, it happens. But it didn't matter because by that time it was too late.
Yeah, too late. Too late. Kat, what about you?
Well, we're gonna head right back to that horrible glitter phrase. Yeah, sure. I had a magical childhood. My parents were divorced before I was a year old, so I went back and forth between my father's house, which was up in Seattle, where it's cold and dark all the time, and my mother's house in California, where it's warm and bright all the time. And I just thought the Persephone story was a story about me. I think that when we're talking about realism and the fantastic, like this is 110% why I don't separate them much, because fairy tales also seem to be just true stories about terrible things that happen to children. I had quite a garbage childhood in many ways. Lots of drama that doesn't need to be gotten into, but I had the wicked stepmother. I had the mother who looks just like me and is never around, and is just a collection of stories about a person that you've never known. And I was Matilda, basically. It was a very strange childhood, and I was also raised with a weird religious situation in that I was raised Christian Scientist, which is not
That is something the three of you have in common there. And I find that interesting in all of your work, the impact of religion. And also, I think maybe, and because I was raised with no religion and therefore tone deaf where these things are concerned, but it seems to me that maybe there's a kind of built-in moment of betrayal in having had a religious upbringing, a sort of moment when you think, wait a second, and feel that you've been lied to. Is that fair? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, Christian Science, without getting too into it, it also has this intense moment. If you ever meet somebody who was raised Christian Science, we all, at some point as children, were told our bodies weren't real. That's part of Christian Science. The phrase is, matter is mortal error. And so, like, if you're sick, it's because your brain is less than perfect, or God hates you, one or the other. And so you have to think more perfectly in order to be well. That there is no such thing as matter. And so, like, that'll mess you up as a kid, just to have a phase where your body isn't real. You're probably gonna end up with an eating disorder. maybe end up a science fiction writer. Like it's a very
You're blowing my mind here.
yeah, no, like it's a messed up religion. You should look into it. And that certainly, I think, really affected my psyche. And there is definitely that moment where you're like, is this something that I'm going to take into my adulthood? And for a lot of kids in Christian Science, that happens when you get really sick. And like your parents have to make a decision about how much this religion means to them. So I'm going to leave it at that so as not to get further into it. But like magical childhood, oh yes. Magical in terms of a beautiful Spielbergian childhood, maybe not.
Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, to keep the religious theme going, I was raised in the Pentecostal church, which is known for, you know, speaking in tongues, being filled with the Holy Ghost. And so, I mean, we were pretty deeply religious. My mother was very devoted. And so we were sort of, the family was there every time the doors were open. And so I spent most of my childhood watching. It was often women who would get filled with the Holy Spirit, but men did as well. So I would just see people who were in my everyday life, like my secretary at school or one of my teachers or someone in the community would go running by shouting in the middle of church, or would fall out slain on the floor in the Holy Spirit. There would be speaking in tongues, and there was usually that if someone spoke in tongues, they couldn't interpret it, so another member of the church would interpret it. So there was this feeling, and I think I see it now so much in my work, this idea of bodies as malleable, this idea of consciousness as shared, this kind of porousness of who we are and of the space that we take up in life, and this kind of odd connectedness between people and spirit and God and otherness, that I don't appreciate a lot about what the church gave me, but I do appreciate that part of it. So that definitely took a lot of magical influence from church. But there are also just a lot of very small magical moments in my childhood when I think back on it. Like I grew up with a family that I don't think they would think of themselves as oral storytellers, but they were. And so there was a lot of folklore and family history kind of passed around, like, oh, you know, the time Papa saw a ghost, and so we would always react in this way when we went past this certain part in the road, you know. So it was sort of this passed down history that was sort of layered over the geography of my home. And my mom and Papa raised a garden when I was little, and I remember huge piles of half-runner beans being stacked up in the living room that were about to be like shucked, but we would kind of jump over them as we went through the house. And there was something just so fantastic about that. You know, the outside was inside, and there was something, you know, such small things can make magic when you're little. And I grew up in a double wide trailer, spent most of my life in one. And when they brought it to be put together on top of our hill, those sort of two sides had to be joined. But for a little while, they were just, there was a gap of maybe a foot or two between them. And I remember jumping between the two halves of what would eventually be my home. And there's something when I think back on that that's like beautiful and magical and strange. And so I'm grateful for those moments, and also grateful for the ability to see the magic in these small things.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have a difficult childhood, or even a childhood that's just outside the ordinary, you really learn to fixate on those small things, because the big things are not so easy to come by, you know. And you know, I understand as an adult my family was all doing their best, but you know, as a child you don't understand anything about anything. And if you're raised not religious, maybe that moment you were talking about, Karen, comes when, you know, you realize that your parents weren't actually doing all of this on purpose. They were trying and failing just like any normal person does. And yeah, I mean, I have those moments that I remember too. And you know, it's such a strange thing. You pull on those as a writer. You pull on those as these little seeds of stories, these seeds of experience.
So when you bring magic into your stories, does it come, I mean, it probably comes from many places, but does it most often come from a landscape, or from a person, or from a talisman, or from an animal, or where do you think you most often locate magic in your own stories?
For me, it depends on the story. you know, it really can come from anywhere. Like,
you seem to me, you know, a very landscape.
I'm a very
oriented.
visual person. Like, I think if I had any ability to draw whatsoever, I would have been an illustrator instead of writer, but I don't at all. I'm a terrible, terrible drawer of things. And so definitely like the visual aspect of it. You know, my dad was a filmmaker. Dominates a lot of the time, but the story for me can start with a line. It can start with, you know, a character. It can start with a core idea, although the core idea is pretty rare for me. Usually it's more imagistic than that. I often think back to, I was at ReaderCon years ago, and I was there with the other guest of honor, and his wife was telling the story, and she did, like, you know, your ears listening to what's going on, but not really, and then it just tinks over because someone said, "Oh, I love to eat gold. Gold's delicious. I would eat it any day." And like, she goes on to, she's talking about edible gold, like on chocolates and things like that. But to listen to a woman talk about, like, she literally said, if my own arm were made of gold, I would eat my arm. Like, these are the things that if you just open your ears, there's magic in what people say and the way they talk. And I think that there actually, so many of my stories have come from a turn of phrase that I've overheard or I remember from my own childhood.
Alyssa, how do you respond to that? Do you also find inspiration in things you overhear?
I mean, although,
is the desert landscape a reliable place of magic for you?
yeah, actually, I was thinking about this. When I was a kid, there was an empty lot next to us, and you know, I grew up, like I said, in the desert with a desert mountain, like basically in the backyard. So you'd have coyotes coming down from the mountain, yelling all night, fighting rabbits, whatever. But we'd go over to this empty lot next door and find all these bones, which I assume had been left there by dogs or something, or maybe the coyotes, I'm not sure. Sometimes you just find animal bits everywhere. So, you know, my friends and I would make up stories about them.
I'm Patrick. Alyssa is frozen on my end. Is it?
Oh no!
Is that just me or?
Alyssa, because you were frozen a second ago too, Karen.
Okay.
So it's our whole situation, not I think any one person.
Go on, Alyssa.
Oh yeah, no. So
bones. The last thing I heard was bones that you thought dogs had probably left there.
Yeah, that seems right. Yeah, so we just make up stories about all the weird animal parts that we found left in various places. It was very exciting to imagine all this stuff. But I think when I think of magic, yeah, like it's very tied to location and land. But I think more than that, it's tied to people. So when it's super tied to location, I think about what that means, like, for that location to be a person, right? I'm always interested in, like, what is inside of people. And I'm also going to greatly credit Tamora Pierce for making me think about magic in certain ways. But I don't know. I think everyone's different. And I think that the way we all process the world is different. And it makes sense to me, at least, that the way that we would process magic and understand it and use it would all be different. So I'm also very interested in family legacy. So family legacy in regards to magic and the way that it's passed down and the way that different people use it is something that I'm very interested in.
Patrick, I have so many more questions. Do I have to stop?
Well, we have a lot of questions from our audience too. Maybe one more, and then we'll squeeze a few extras in.
Okay, that sounds good. This question, I'm going to start by quoting Ashley, who has said in an interview, "I think there can be something unfair and maybe even dangerous about focusing too much attention on pain. It flattens life in a way that doesn't seem real. It's messier than just moments of hurt. And so I wanted just to hear from you sort of about the function of joy in your work. Do you look for moments of joy that you can give your characters? Are you actively trying to produce moments of joy on the page? And maybe since Ashley, I got that quote from you, maybe you would answer first.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about that particular area. As someone who writes about trauma, and that seems to be something that I'm kind of drawn toward and kind of work out continually on a page. It's something that I try really hard to find a balance and not lingering too long in pain, not putting too fine a lens on it, not glorifying or heightening it in such a way that feels it just feels wrong to me. You know, it feels
self-indulgent maybe.
Yeah. Well, and also an indulgent, I think, of things that our media already does, right? I think the way that like sexual assault is used in media, the way that physical violence and brutality is used, it tends to be an inundation of those things. And there's just so much more to life and even to trauma itself. Something in my book, Every Bone a Prayer, it deals with sexual abuse. And one of the things that I was really determined to do is that the scenes or moments in which there are actual details of the abuse take up, I think, 7 pages in what is over a 300-page book. And I didn't want a page more. I wanted to make it as small as possible and to have most of the book focus on what comes after, what is the result of this, how does this character sort of come back to herself. Because that's so much of what my experience has been, is that, you know, the actual traumatic event is quite small or often occupies a much smaller sliver of space. But it has a really outsized effect on life, right? It has a tremendous sort of ripple effect. And that's the part that I'm more interested in. I don't want to glorify or linger in the violence, but I want to show more of the complexity. And joy is such an important part of that complexity. Like there's no traumatic story that I've ever lived through or heard that doesn't include moments of just beautiful, bright, wonderful happiness and laughter and you know, like, and it's so important to have those moments. And so it's something that I think a lot about. I do try in my head, my story is, it's a weird kind of synesthetic kind of feeling of like sort of stones stacked on this very thin wire and sort of the weight of the story. And I can kind of feel like when it's gotten heavier in places, and I will try to compensate for that, or I'll try to think about what would follow that naturally in terms of happiness, or a lighter scene, or a scene, even like there's a scene in my book where the character eats cornbread soaked in milk. And it's just like a long kind of little paragraph or two of meditation on that as a sensory experience, as pleasure, as comfort, you know, that food making her feel safe and loved. And those moments can be really small, but I think they're really necessary in telling a whole story, especially when you're dealing with heavier material or violence, at least for me.
I think when I was young and first starting out, I would have completely disagreed and said, no, like I need my pain and I need, you know, it's not serious literature if it's not painful. And, you know, all of that. I was so kind of working out all my own stuff when I first was starting out. And now I would completely agree. Now, as, you know, 41 years old, I think joy is much harder than pain. It's much more difficult to write about in a way that feels meaningful and necessary and real. It's much more difficult to achieve. And in my own life, like there's definitely was a time where I would have said like, no, I can't go on medication for depression because I need to, you know, maintain whatever ball of pain the work is coming out of. And now I understand that I do so much more work when I'm not in a place of pain. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the work is light or you know, hallmarky. I wrote Deathless and the first Fairyland book back to back, and I would say that's probably my darkest and my lightest book. And I wrote them both during one of the happiest times of my life. And I think that happiness is a better soil than pain for whatever plant rises out of it. Unfortunately, they don't always sell happiness at the Home Depot in large bags.
A lot of people haven't gotten that message.
But I think what you said was really profound. And I think that we're sort of, especially with, I mean, not to be a commercial that says with times being what they are, but I think that we are all looking for stories that lead us to joy, or at least point us towards it. And many of us are quite lost with trying to find it, and that's part of what we turn to literature for. So yeah, I think, and I think what you said about, you know, not dwelling on the moment of pain to glorify it is something that is improving the genre these days, as opposed to where it used to be. And yeah, I guess I'm just saying you're right in a really long-winded way.
Alyssa, do you have any responses to any of that?
I mean, I also think you're right. But yeah, I agree. I think it depends, for me, it depends on what I'm writing for. And again, if it is just me processing my own stuff, or who I expect to look at it and how I want people to feel. And I do think it is a very delicate balance, and it depends piece by piece. But also, sometimes I'm just sad and I don't want to be sad anymore.
Yeah, I have had a long, hard road explaining to my friends that if I'm writing a really desperately unhappy story, I must be in a good place, or I wouldn't be able to do that. And when I'm writing the light and frothy stuff, that's when you should call me and say, how are you feeling? And, you know, not with the other stuff. Because I think I tend to use my work to balance whatever is going on in my life in that way.
My little baby son, of course, is just learning to talk because he's a baby. And one of his first words, and the word he says most often, is happy. He'll say happy, happy when he's happy. But he will also say it when he's crying because he wants to be happy. He'll go, happy. And I feel like that's sort of what we're talking about here, that like the use of happiness is both in the midst of pain and in the midst of itself.
Absolutely. Well, that's perfect. All right, Patrick, I'm turning it over to you. Not that I don't have pages and pages more questions.
I know. I'm sure everyone would be happy to stay on for several more hours, but I know we were all juggling lots of other things. But I know one thing that a few people have asked, and we have a lot of, I think, emerging writers on the call, was, I guess, about the joy and pain of starting to make it as a writer, and what that looked like for you, and if there's any advice you have for people who are kind of hitting some of those early roadblocks and how to push through them. Alyssa, maybe we could start with you, especially, I mean, you've found success in so many different ways. It's especially exciting.
I guess, yeah, no, it's exciting. I think that you should embrace that excitement. And I think that you should be proud of the work you do. And I think you should also remember not to be a jerk to people. Because I feel like I've seen that a lot. For me, at least, one thing that happened was like people started to treat me kind of different. And I didn't like that. And I think it's important to remember that you are still the person you were before anyone read XYZ story, or before you got whatever job, whatever, you're still that person. And that's actually something you should be proud of. It's like, you know, I don't know, the work is the work, and just be good to people. Sorry, that's like really weird advice, but like
great advice.
It seems perfect.
Actually, you're closer to the beginning of your career. Maybe you could address some of these obstacles.
I would definitely echo everything that Alyssa just said. And I think one of the things that I've noticed the most about sort of progressing through the kind of like milestones of writerhood is that it's really easy to keep moving your goalposts and to kind of set your happiness on, I will feel like a writer, or I will feel good about myself when I sell my first short story, which then becomes when I sell my first pro-rate short story, if that's not it, which then becomes like when I sell my fifth, or whenever I write a book, whenever I get an agent, whenever I sell the book, right? So you sort of like can get to this place where you keep pushing off a feeling of happiness or fulfillment because you're hanging it on these achievements, right? These moments that are very temporary. And it's really important to celebrate not just those moments, but I think every little interim moment, because I think publishing has this weird effect on time and this weird effect on everything, and that it's really easy to let those moments slip by when they happen. So it's important to celebrate them and mark them, but it's also, I think, important to not depend on them solely for how you see yourself or how good you feel on a day-to-day basis, because there's going to be good writing days and bad writing days. And there's always going to be someone who has something that you don't, who wins an award that you don't, who has a panel, or, you know, there's always going to be something out there that if that's all that you're hanging on to, then you're never going to have enough, right? There can never be enough to sort of shore up a whole self, very temporary achievements. And so I've worked really hard as a very achievement-oriented, goal-oriented human being to focus, and especially to come back to why I started writing in the first place. You know, those feelings that I get from when I write a really beautiful sentence, or whenever I work through something, or when I see a character for the first time, or when I leave the page frustrated and then 2 days later I'm washing dishes and it hits me and I suddenly know how to fix all of my problems, and that rush and that good feeling, because it's the process, right? It's like, that's going to be the thing you're left with between all the achievements, between all of those great moments, is you and the work. So really developing a good relationship to yourself, right? Taking care of your mental health, making sure that you're okay, making sure that you're coming to the work for the right reasons. Those have all been really, really important for me in the last year or so, especially since I sold the book. But even before then, you know, I can see that I've done that. And then the other little thing would be find your people, find your community as best you can, and in whatever way that is, Twitter, Slacks, emails, whatever it is, like community writing groups, to not to sort of combat some of that isolation, is to find people who are, you know, in a similar place to you, a little bit further down the road, you know, however you can kind of draw near to you, and hold those people really close and support each other through the good and the bad. It really helps.
I guess something I would say is the road is long. On one side of publication, you tend to get really fixated on the goalposts that you're talking about, and then those first early goalposts of just something published, or you know, something published in a specific place, or a book. But when I first signed my first novel contract, which was like 17 years ago now, like, it hit me that publication is not, it's just the first step. There's so much more work to do on the other side of that first publication. And no matter, man, unless lightning hits you really hard, you are going to have a lot of ups and downs on that road. And you can achieve just about everything that the outside world says makes a successful writer, and still have trouble selling the next book. Success on one end does not equal success all the way through, nor does failure on one end equal failure all the way through. You know, your whole life is never based on one story or one book. It is a long, long race with yourself and your insecurity. Because we all have it. We all compare ourselves. You shouldn't, but people do. We're human. If we ever got enough love as children, we wouldn't be artists. And you really have to find your own sort of way through that, and be nice to people. Like, take care of people on the way up, and they'll take care of you on the way down. There's no reason to make enemies in this world and this field, and especially when, like, in this field, all you have to do to not make an enemy is not be an egregious asshole. Like, you just don't have to do that. You can just easily choose not to. And I think that something that I'm really holding on to right now is, don't forget that you love books. that you got into this because you love books, because you love touring or being on panels or you know, having the authority to tell people what's what, but because you love books and you love stories. And don't lose that love. Don't lose the ability to pick up a book and fall into it without your editor brain kicking in and picking apart what's wrong with it. Just remember how magical books are, and that we're all here at the well for that magic.
I love that.
Yeah,
Patrick, do we have time for something else?
That's great. Maybe we can fit in one more. I'm going to kind of jam two questions together here. But there's people are really curious if there's something from, say, your early development as a writer, or even more recently, an aspect of craft or technique that kind of shifted the way you approached your storytelling and telling speculative stories, either that you learned at Clarion or you learned elsewhere that you can pass along. Maybe Kat, we'll start with you and go in the reverse order.
I feel like I don't quite understand the question. Like, just what I can we repeat the question in a shorter form?
Yeah, of course.
I think in some ways it's, you know, can you teach writing, and is there something that you have actually learned that you can now share?
I feel like, and I will say, look, ask 100 writers about who's taught them writing and you'll have 100 wildly different stories. I've had, I feel like all of the writing instruction I have ever had has been a series of traumas where the lessons are the ways I have gotten over that trauma, or indeed incorporate them into my personality as indelible flaws. So I think one of the things that professors early on instilled in me is a gut deep terror of cliches. There is nothing like a literary writer to shame a genre writer for using cliches, and not very many genre writers in the mid-90s had university positions, so I got a lot of that. And I think that was very valuable for me, but it is definitely a complex rather than like a useful lesson learned. And I think almost everything involved in writing instruction for me was a series of professors telling me I was never any good and I was never going to make it. And that's fine. I sent the first one that said that a pile of my books when I hit my 10th book, and I'm fine with it. And I do actually value some of that feeling of shame and anger, because some of that shame and anger turned into, fuck you, I'll show you how much I'm going to make it. And that fire was something that I really needed at one point in my my career. I do think you can teach. Maybe you can't necessarily teach every aspect of writing. You can't necessarily teach that spark, but you can teach faith in yourself. You can teach, you know, having some kind of root in the sort of mythic story and branches in technique and craft, and you can teach never letting anybody tell you you're no good and you'll never make it. That you can teach.
Ashley, how about you?
The thing that leapt to mind were a couple of things I learned at Clarion during the last couple of weeks. So Cece Finley, who is the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and Ray Carson, who is an incredible writer, were our anchor team. So we got to spend 2 weeks with them. And there were a couple of things that I learned from them that I've really taken with me and have come just part of my process now. So one is really simple, and it seems really small, but it can have a profound effect on the way your story looks and feels, and that's paragraphing, which is just really paying attention to your story at a paragraph level, and paying attention to the sentence that begins and the sentence that ends, and paying attention to if you have buried important information in the middle of a paragraph, right? So that may be a good chance to break it there and have that be the start of a new paragraph. Also paying attention to the general length that you write at, because most people tend to sort of write generally the same length of paragraph over and over again, right? There's sort of a natural rhythm that you'll fall into, and it's either, you know, small, medium, or long. and sort of being thoughtful about that and saying, you know, here's a really important moment. I'm normally a medium length paragraph writer, so I'm going to make this one extra long or extra short. So that variation kind of stands out. And it's something that I now go back and use and almost every time, especially with short fiction, but even with novels that I'm when I'm revising. And then the other one is a tool that I'll use during a revision, but also if I'm feeling stuck, like a story just isn't really coming together. And it's to reverse outline the story, which just means you make an outline of it based on what you've already written, right? So it's kind of like you just go whoop, and shorten it really tight, like just into sentences or a couple of sentences, and you kind of can think of it then in terms of like a 3-act structure or whatever way you kind of structure stories, and try to find the part that kind of falls off or doesn't align, or the part where you kind of slipped or it sags. Because when it's condensed that way, I think it also helps. It's kind of like when you write a synopsis, which is a form of torture, I think, when you try to synopsize your own work. But there is something really beautiful in trying to condense your work, that it makes the important parts or the parts that you share stand out, and it makes you think about how you're supporting them, introducing them, the parts that could fall away, that kind of thing. So the reverse outline kind of works in that way of helping to condense it so that you just see this bite-sized version of the story you've written. And it can make it feel a little less overwhelming to start that revision process. And it can usually point in the direction of the place where I've kind of gotten off track or could kind of shore things up. So those two things were specifically from Clarion and are things that I use all the time now as a writer.
I guess things for me too. The first one is that I think a lot about voice. I think about the way things make me feel when they're said certain ways. So one thing that I did and actually still do is that's actually why I read a lot of poetry. Like Eugie Foster is just, he's so good. And the way his words light up the inside of my head are beautiful. But other things that I've read to make me remember to connect with the way words make me feel include a lot of fanfic. Oh my God, so much fanfic. I read a remarkable amount of Teen Wolf fanfic for someone who's never seen Teen Wolf. So it's another person who taught me, like, who showed me that writing can be like really dark and sexy is Holly Black. Oh my God, so good. So I think one thing that I do and that I super am like, yeah, you should do it, is read the stuff that makes you that makes your heart happy, that gets you excited, and that you're like, wow, that's really sexy. I want to learn how to do that. And the second thing I learned was to never let anybody tell you what you can and can't do. Because when I was an undergrad, I took some creative writing classes, and the professors were always like, well, don't write science fiction or fantasy. It's it's either it's frivolous or it's too hard or whatever. And I remember being like, okay, and then turning in only science fiction the entire semester. I think we come into writing with a lot of preconceived notions of what writing should be and what stories should be and what stories are expected from us. And it's all bullshit. Like, it doesn't matter. I think it's really important to think about the thing that makes you happy, because when you have it, it changes your writing so much. Like, I could not get my shit together until I figured out, like, oh, maybe the story is actually about something I love, like Big Fish or whatever. And that just opened up everything for me.
I love that. And now I want to know if there's Eugie Wong fanfic. Something to search out. So I know we're already a little over time. Oh yeah, of course.
From what Alyssa said, one of the people who will tell you what stories can and can't be is sometimes yourself, and don't listen to yourself either. There have been many times where I've thought, you can't do that in a book, can't do that in a middle grade book, can't do that in a science fiction book, can't do that in a cat. And that's always turns out to be the best part.
Agreed. And I feel like I'm going to be shamed if I don't. So many people have asked, Ashley, can you tell us just really quickly what's going on behind you with all those note cards and your organization system?
Yeah, that all this business somewhere in there is my second book. Plot is hard. Often in my head, it's just sort of a string of question marks, like plot. So in order to help me get sort of stay on track with the plot of my second book, it's just a 3-act structure. You can't really tell from this angle. And each of the index cards are with a really cut up construction paper in different colors, because I'm very visual, and I think of stories as threads that sort of get woven together. So each of the colors represents a different thread, which is usually a character or recurring theme or recurring image, or sort of something that kind of happens and unfolds throughout. And it helps me stay on track. It helps me see where one of the colors has kind of fallen away, so I need to kind of bring it back in. It's been very useful. I need a lot of tools to help me write my books, and this has been a helpful one.
That's amazing. I might have to try that.
Yeah.
Well, I know we've kind of gone a little bit over. I hope that's okay. But Karen, did you have any final words?
I thought you were all incredible. Just so wonderful. Thank you so much
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank
for
you.
sharing all that with us and being so eloquent. You all, you're good with words. You should think about being writers.
Yes, thank you all. I wish we could have the applause of all 275 people thanking you too, but they do thank you, and so we appreciate you spending some time with us tonight, and we hope everyone will join us next week for our next Clarion conversation, moderated by Kim Stanley Robinson, with Eileen Gunn, Ted Chang, Lillian Rivera, and Sam J. Miller as guests. So we'll keep this going throughout the 6 weeks of the Write-a-thon, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, and do take a look at the Write-a-thon if you have a chance.
All right, well then thank you all, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.